Our panel to talk about this. Harry Houck is a retired NYPD detective. Cheryl Dorsey is with us from Los Angeles. She is a retired LAPD sergeant and the author of the book Black and Blue, The Creation of a Manifesto. Thank you both for being with me. I appreciate it. Harry, let me turn to you first. Looking at this, the lawyer has now turned over to CNN these documents. The Tulsa World paper has said, look, their sources say some of them were falsified, that this reserve officer did not have the 480 hours of training necessary.
Right.
Regardless of if he did or not, does this call into question whether reserve officers, basically voluntary police officers, should be able to carry guns and potentially kill people?
Well, they do all over the country. You know, we don't do it here in New York City, but there's reserve officers they carry all over the country.
But should they be able to? Does this bring into the fore this issue?
I don't know. I mean, we have an instance here where I think we got to look at the age of the gentleman.
73 years old.
73 years old.
So you're talking about his reflexes.
You know, I know police officers are forced off the job in some departments at 62. All right, so here's a guy that was 73 years old on the scene where he shouldn't have been and resulted in this horrible shooting. So I think the big issue here is the department itself where, you know, I've never been an opponent of politics and law enforcement blending together. I've never been an opponent of any law enforcement official being voted into office either. I mean, I think this will show you right here an example of why that's a problem.
Well, you're talking about the fact that this is someone who had donated a lot to that police department,
sure,
who was friends with the sheriff, but he says in the sheriff's department maintains that had nothing to do with it. You know, he was helpful to the group policing where he lived, and he wanted to do everything he could to help. Right. Cheryl, to you, what is your reaction to this?
Well, first of all, I find it interesting that Mr. Bates' attorney would try to discredit the deputy that he says is sitting in jail charged with murder, because after all, isn't Mr. Bates charged with something very heinous? And so who do you believe? And understand that just because those documents exist, we don't necessarily know if they're valid, because there is that rumor out there that those who didn't speak the company speak and weren't willing to falsify records were moved. And so it's very telling to me when the sheriff stands before a bank of cameras and is asked about Mr. Bates' verification of his credentials and qualifications, what he says is, as best I know, or to the best of my knowledge. That sounds like double talk. That sounds like code talk for, if you catch me later and he wasn't qualified, I'll just say to the best of my knowledge, I thought he was.
Cheryl, one thing I want you both to respond to this. One thing that that Robert Bates did and showed when he was on the Today Show yesterday being interviewed is the very different location on his body where his taser is held versus where his gun is held. Let me ask you first, Cheryl, as someone who served in the LAPD, is it possible that even with the required training that could happen, or that has happened to anyone else that you know?
Well, certainly I don't know if it's happened to anyone else, but what I would say is based on my training and as an experience, it should not happen. Because you train so that when you're in a moment of excitement and stressful situations, you act on second nature. You just do that thing that you've practiced over and over. And we understand, according to Mr. Bates, he received 300 hours of training between 2008 and 2015. If you do the math, we're talking about maybe 42 hours of training per week on average over a 7-year period, and he hasn't fired his weapon at the range since the fall of 2014. It's inadequate. The training is inadequate, and he performed in a way that would explain the lack of training that he's had over these last several months and maybe years.
Harry, there are professions where, I mean, most professions, you cannot be a volunteer. You cannot be a volunteer brain surgeon, right?
Right, exactly.
Should you be able to, should you be able to be a volunteer officer?
Well, volunteer officers are, you know, utilized by police departments in the country basically just for things like traffic and parades and things like that.
This was a set-up sting operation. They brought him on a sting operation.
This is the problem, and I said this is the problem before, is what happens when you inject politics in law enforcement, all right? This guy was allowed to, it appears to me that this guy's allowed to be on scenes like this, right, where he's not a professional. And I'll tell you what, you probably won't get any of these officers to speak out about it, but I bet you those officers don't like the idea of a man like that being on the scene either.
Let's remember also that the Oklahoma NAACP has now called for an investigation into this because they say, look, none of the other officers have been charged. You know that there was another officer who had his knee on Eric Harris's head during this situation. So we'll see how that develops. Let's also remember that today, right now, the friends and family of Eric Harris are saying their final goodbyes at his visitation as he is about to be laid to rest. Appreciate it. We got to take a quick break and talk more about this on the other side. Also, something we're following very closely, the center of the Republican universe